least in the field of basic sciences and in relation to the mechanisms and potential protection against noise-induced hearing loss. Being the first speaker, I will start out with a few general statistics, and I apologize if they are familiar to many of you, but still I would like to review some of those. And considering noise in the context of hearing loss worldwide, it is a substantial portion of overall hearing loss. If you calculate the numbers, it comes out to about 1/3 or one half of all hearing losses and also disabling hearing losses are derived from noise trauma. Of course, once we get older, as my predecessor on the podium and myself, then of course age-related hearing loss will set in, which then eventually becomes the most prevalent form of hearing loss. Now, noise-induced hearing loss is certainly nothing new. We might associate it with the modern society. It came, of course, already in ancient times with millers and blacksmiths and boilermakers. At one point, noise-induced hearing loss was essentially called boilermakers' deafness. And then the problem got aggravated and is still a major problem, not only in industry, but of course also in the battlefield and even in this century when the troops returned from the combat fields in the US, hearing loss and associated trauma was the #1 diagnosis. And we all know that, of course, it is not only professional noise that gives us problems. We're having a lot of fun these days, ruining our own hearing. I'm sure there are many old enough to recognize who this guy is. Remember him? Yeah, okay. Pete Townshend from The Who, and why am I showing him? #1, The Who at one point held the record for the loudest concerts with 127 dB. That was later surpassed, but Guinness Book of World Records stopped keeping those numbers, and that was a good thing. But mostly, he found it already in the 70s or 80s, I think, the Association Hearing Education and Awareness for Rockers, based on his own hearing loss and tinnitus. So, after this general point, I would like to tell you we have a solution already for noise-induced hearing loss. We can treat hearing loss, and I really don't know why we have this conference here. About 150 years ago, Joseph Toynbee clearly cured his patients with the application of leeches and mild laxatives. I don't know why it did not catch on. Maybe it's because laxatives on the battlefield are not the best idea. But in any case, take this home and try it on your patients, please. The basic anatomical, pathological features of noise-induced hearing loss have really long been known. And this might not even be the first detailed report on the pathology of noise-induced hearing loss. Namely, the realization that hair cells are being lost, and also the realization that the nerve eventually will also degenerate. And those two features, hair cell loss and degeneration of the nerves, are still the major pathological signs of hearing loss that we know today. And we know very detailed information about these pathologies and some of the mechanisms from experiments in animals. And some of the first were done actually at the turn of the century. Here you have some really wonderful contraptions mimicking impulse noise by Huxley. This is a wonderful machine. Just see the water faucet here that eventually will drive a hammer which comes down on a steel drum in which you have 4 guinea pigs. And then, and this I find absolutely amazing, look at the quality of these drawings of hearing of the cochlea before and after noise. Absolutely astounding. Hair cells are still present. Hair cells are gone after impulse noise. So this is the basic scenario for noise-induced hearing loss and the pathological appearance. Now, my talk says that I will also mention, at least in passing, ototoxicity. And the reason is that we can really learn a little bit by comparison and get some hints on mechanisms and hints on potential treatments from comparing noise trauma with drug-induced, primarily aminoglycoside-induced, and age-related hearing loss. And the pathology, as I briefly mentioned for noise, is almost identical, at least in some features, between those three forms of acquired hearing loss. A permanent loss of hearing cells, until we learn how to regenerate hair cells. We are on the way, but we are certainly not there, probably not for a decade or more. And then, following the loss of the hair cells, or so it was assumed following the loss of hair cells, a degeneration of the nerve. These are some human specimens that you see here. I will come back to the question, which is first the loss of hair cells or the loss of nerve cells. Okay, so after this very general assessment of the current state of affairs of acquired hearing loss, let me share with you some of the potential mechanisms that are being discussed and largely accepted also in the scientific community about the underlying causes of acquired hearing loss. And for all three, noise, drugs, age, there's indication that oxidative stress plays a role in the demise of the hair cells. Not necessarily causal, might be causal for noise, might be causal for drugs. For age, we are a little bit less certain. This is followed by the cell's response to try to maintain its integrity and finally an upregulation of cell death pathways. A very brief recapitulation of oxidant stress. Oxidant stress is a really necessary evil in our metabolism. As we are sitting here and breathing, we are all generating reactive oxygen species because they are part of normal metabolism. It's only the excess of reactive oxygen species that then will eventually lead to the demise of the cells because of the damage to proteins, lipids, DNA, and the like. So life is a balancing act because these reactive oxygen species are balanced under normal circumstances with our own antioxidants inside the cells. And this is an important point that will also feed into any efforts to protect us against noise-induced hearing loss. So we have, very basically speaking, in a normal cell, we have a redox balance, which is the balance between the reactive oxygen species from our metabolism and our endogenous cellular antioxidants. And that's why we are still alive, and that's why we do not necessarily have to take our daily antioxidants because our cells are usually quite well endowed with antioxidants. However, if noise or certain drugs will impact the system, then the reactive oxygen species will go up, an oxidative imbalance will ensue, redox-sensitive signaling pathways will kick in, and eventually the cell will die. Now this seems to be a very simplistic scenario, but there's a good deal of evidence that this actually is happening, at least in drug and noise-induced hearing loss. And let me show you some evidence for this. Here are markers for oxidative stress in the cochlea after noise trauma. You cannot measure reactive oxygen species directly, but you can see the fingerprints, the evidence of the crime in the cochlea, and comparing the intensity of the staining here, you see that there's a widespread increase in reactive oxygen species or their products after noise trauma. And the same is true for aminoglycoside-induced hearing loss, where particularly in the area of the hair cells and surrounding areas, there's a huge increase in reactive oxygen species before the hair cells will eventually die. Now, if this is indeed the case, that oxidative stress is part of the mechanism, then there should be a relatively straightforward solution to the problem. Because on the one hand, we have noise and drugs increasing reactive oxygen species, but we can manipulate our own cellular antioxidants by antioxidant supplementation. Whenever we take in food, quite obviously, whatever we eat ends up in the bloodstream and then in the tissues, and antioxidants do the same to some extent. Our body is very much geared towards homeostasis, so if you swallow loads and loads of something like antioxidants, the cells in the body will simply kick it out. So there's a limit to what we can do. But we can certainly supplement our own antioxidants, and there are several ways of doing it. We have our endogenous antioxidants, and we could take, if we like, additional glutathione or vitamin E. We can eat broccoli, if you like to eat your broccoli, or we can, of course, have my preferred dietary form, which is red wine. Now, don't assume that a glass of red wine will necessarily keep your hearing, although there's some very, very intriguing evidence from some studies on 3 continents that a modest amount of alcohol will really attenuate age-related hearing loss. That's true. But if you wanted to go to a rock concert and protect yourself with wine, I've made the calculation based on the amount of resveratrol that protects against noise. You would have to drink, before the concert, you have to drink 5 or 6 bottles of wine. So, take an example. The antioxidants should protect if the scenario is correct, and indeed they do. We have an example here of some of our own studies, and you can see the beautifully outlined surface preparation of outer hair cells here, a complete destruction by gentamicin in vivo, and then an almost perfect, not quite perfect, rescue with antioxidants. And indeed, quite a number of antioxidants will protect, and they will not only protect the hair cells, they will also protect auditory function, as we measure here with ABR, and you see the threshold shifts that go from about 60 in the control to less than 10 or so in those animals treated with antioxidants. And I, in particular, would like to point you to hydroxybenzoate as an antioxidant, because I will come back to that in a couple of slides. So, we have protection in animals, and the question is a very general one. If we see protection of the inner ear in animals, can we translate this to human? And here's where aminoglycosides come in. I already showed you that there was oxidant stress in aminoglycoside treatment. Now, aminoglycosides, very, very briefly, still probably the most commonly used antibiotics nowadays, because they're cheap and used worldwide. Incidence is terrific. If you really go to very high frequencies, you can find 50% of hearing loss in short-term treatment. A recent study on tuberculosis patients, 100% in the long run have some hearing loss. And there's another application that recently emerged, and that is the attenuation of genetic disorders. Because about 20% of genetic disorders are based on premature stop codons, where one of the codons that normally codes for an amino acid is, with a point mutation, changed to a stop codon. You get truncated proteins, dysfunctional proteins, and then manifestation of genetic disorders. And aminoglycoside antibiotics, due to their effect on the translation apparatus in the cell, can actually screw up the translation in such a way that the cell mistakes this stop codon for an amino acid codon, and you will get a functional protein, at least to some extent, to attenuate genetic disorders. And this is a very much coming field and a hot topic in drug research. And then we take the experience with the animals to the humans. I mentioned hydroxybenzoate. Hydroxybenzoate is essentially what happens to aspirin. Once you take it in, after 20 minutes, it's salicylated. And here we have the evidence that translation from the animal to the human is possible. The study that we did back about 10 years and more ago, a 75% reduction in the incidence of gentamicin-induced hearing loss in patients on short-term treatment. So, we can do it. What about antioxidants and noise trauma? Antioxidants very similarly protect against noise trauma. And we have an example here of several antioxidants. And the one in red that I marked in red is N-acetylcysteine, which has frequently and is still frequently being used as a protectant both in animals and actually in humans, as I will show. Now, it's not only N-acetylcysteine. One point that really makes the story of oxidant stress and potential protection very plausible is that many compounds that have antioxidant properties, regardless of their secondary properties, will protect against noise-induced hearing loss. But also quite a number of other compounds, and we still have to figure out where exactly in the pathway these compounds act. But none of them really gives you 100% protection against noise-induced hearing loss. The other point is that when you translate from animals to humans, unfortunately, animal experiments do not always mimic the conditions under which humans are exposed to noise. Continuous noise is one of the more common forms of noise exposure in animals, while impulse noise probably is more prevalent in hearing loss that you find in humans. So that is one of the questions, but the other question is, what about after? Animal experiments are wonderful. You know exactly when the noise exposure takes place. But in humans, and particularly on the battlefield, you do not know. And these free radicals and the hair cell loss is spreading after noise exposure. Immediately after, you see a very sharp peak in the loss of hair cells, and then by 2 weeks, without any additional noise exposure, this has broadened considerably. So we need to know where and at which point we can actually stop the loss of hair cells. And here you see that the most efficient rescue is if the antioxidant is applied before the noise exposure, and then with increasing time after noise exposure, you see that the effect of the antioxidant diminishes. So that's a bit of a problem. But the good news is that we have a treatment identified in animals, that there might be a window, and we can translate this to animals. But there are some open questions that are already mentioned. And one of the probably really confounding variables in clinical trials is that not all ears are equal. Humans are not inbred animals. And here's the point. I mean, this guy here, I'm not commenting on the total insuitability of his clothing for a blacksmith. Hephaestus, the blacksmith in the Greek mythology, never ever any mention of noise-induced hearing loss in all of Homer or Greek mythology. So this is one indication that genetics actually determines susceptibility to noise. And here are some factors that have been established in humans that convey increased susceptibility to noise. You will see that some of these relate to antioxidant in the cells. The first 3, 4 also is related to cell protection. And this variability is not always taken, or very rarely taken into account in clinical or other forms of trials in protection against noise-induced hearing loss. But what it does is shown here. And here is a summary of TTS models, temporary threshold shift models of noise-induced hearing loss. Well, we are all aware that in volunteers, of course, permanent threshold shift models really pose an ethical problem. So permanent threshold shifts mostly, as you will see in the next slide, were investigated in industrial settings or military settings. I would like to point out number 4 here, N-acetylcysteine, 53 subjects. And let me tell you, the authors of this study are quite straightforward with their results, but I've seen this study cited as N-acetylcysteine protects against noise-induced hearing loss. But if you read the fine print in the paper, it is not across the board. It is only in a subgroup of workers with null genotypes, with absence of glutathione as transferase, which is one enzyme in glutathione and redox metabolism. So the authors already know this does not work necessarily in you and me, only if you have a deficiency in antioxidant pathway. And then if you look further into the fine print, the threshold shift they found in the controls were 3 dB and in the protected group 1 dB. If you're an audiologist, you might comment on that. I have my own opinion on this. Now, permanent threshold shift in military settings. Again, a number of studies, but let me point out one of the difficulties in interpretation here. And number 1, a study in the Israeli army is one example. Yes, there was a lower incidence of permanent threshold shift in the magnesium group than in the placebo. But regardless of treatment, the threshold shift always was low in subjects with higher magnesium. So if you physiologically already have high magnesium levels, you are better protected. And magnesium supplement would not work in you. It would only work if you are in a condition of hypomagnesemia. Some of these conditions will apply everywhere across the board because we are a mixed population. N-acetylcysteine was promising, but we don't really have any hard evidence that it will protect. Now, these were all prospective. Here we have post-traumatic rescue. And in post-traumatic rescue, you have another problem, and that is the application of a placebo, which is unethical if you suspect that you have an effective treatment to help. So here we can only extrapolate that those interventions might be possible compared to what is assumed a normal course of recovery without intervention. These studies were done quite a while ago, almost 10 years ago, and I've not yet seen a follow-up on these in the literature, so I'm very doubtful that they have had much clinical impact. Here's a list for your education and for us to discuss. These are the clinical trials that are currently registered at the NIH website, clinical trials to protect against noise-induced hearing loss. And you see that only one, and that's the study in the workers on TTS with N-acetylcysteine, the first one. Only one has published results. The others, although concluded 2 or 3 years ago, have not reported any results yet. So we have to wait. At the moment, we are quite uncertain whether or not these treatments will work. There's good indication from animal experiments that they should work. There's some hints that they might work in humans, but firm evidence at the moment is still missing. And here comes another question. And that question is, have we been looking at the right things here, or have we been barking up the wrong tree of reactive oxygen species in hair cells? Because more recently it has emerged in animal experiments that one of the early events in noise-induced hearing loss, drug-induced hearing loss, age-related hearing loss is not the loss of hair cells followed by nerve degeneration, but the degeneration of the synaptic connections between hair cells and the nerve. This looks about like this. Okay, here we go. Okay. At the inner hair cell synapse, in this study, Kuchel and Lieberman stained the synaptic endings, and you can just eyeball that the synaptic endings in the noise-exposed animals certainly have been reduced considerably. And what also happens is that some of the auditory physiology has been affected. And the fact that this is a hidden hearing loss, and I'm sure we'll hear more from my next speaker, the term hidden hearing loss comes from the fact that if you look at the recovery of the ABR threshold shifts, and here is before, here is immediately after noise, and here is after 14 days, you see that the ABR, you see that the ABR threshold perfectly recovers. So we would say this animal absolutely has not suffered from noise exposure at all. However, if you look at the wave 1 amplitude, the input-output function of the ABR, then you see that there is a significant difference between the original and between the resulting input-output. So we have here, and in animal experimentation, absolutely new concept. We here have measurement that was never done in all the studies that I've showed you before. So we don't know whether the protection by antioxidants, which protects against hair cell loss, would also protect against these and against the loss of synapses, which might be associated with a hidden hearing loss. But there is hope for recovery or even of these nerve endings. And looking here at some experiments from recent papers by Gabriel Corpus and his collaborators, we have again the situation of a normal cochlea stained for synaptic connections. Trauma, noise trauma, reduces considerably the number of synaptic endings at the hair cells. But if we add, or if they add, neurotrophin 3, one of the neurotrophic factors that maintains the integrity of the cochlea in the intact animal, then you see the number of synaptic endings is restored, quite well restored. And again, they show ABR, they also show DPOAE. There's no effect of noise or treatment on DPOAE, as if nothing had happened. But if again, you now look at the input-output, you look at the amplitude of wave 1, you see that there's a distinct and significant difference between the original, the control, and the eventually ensuing 14 days later wave from wave number 1 from the ABR. So these are all illustrations that there is more to noise-induced hearing loss, at least in animals, than we have hitherto assumed. And we have to pay probably a lot more attention to the hidden hearing loss in animals and maybe in humans. In animals also, if you expose these animals to this type of noise, which will not give you any permanent ABR shift, and supposedly is innocuous, those animals at later ages will have an accelerated age-related hearing loss. Extrapolating from this, if you go to your rock concert or play in the band and your ABR, your audiogram recovers, you might suffer from this in later years once you're hit 30, 40, or 50, or even more. So this is the new scenario. And the rescue here, at least with neurotrophin, is a maintenance of the synaptic endings. Noise trauma will cause acute synaptopathy. NT3 can restore it. And eventually, this might be a treatment because NT3 can be applied to the round window. And some of this was round window delivery. And even after noise trauma for a few days, this will work. So we have two scenarios here. One is the antioxidant and one is the NT3. Let me just, in the remaining few minutes, a quick detour, because I started on aminoglycosides and protection. Where do we stand now in terms of protection against aminoglycoside-induced hearing loss? Well, protection is not what we want. Protection is where we should not spend money on clinical trials, because this is the problem with the drugs nowadays. The emergence of superbugs, of multi and extremely drug-resistant antibiotics. So the challenge is to design new antibiotics and not find new protectants against aminoglycoside-induced hearing loss. And because I will not go into this in any details, we've teamed up with a group in Switzerland, Eric Böttger, for the next generation of antibacterials that are non-ototoxic, and with Tomi Basov in Haifa, non-ototoxic stop codon suppressors. I'll just give you one hint of where we stand. If we look at animal experimentations with gentamicin, about 100–120 milligrams per kilogram for 14 days in a guinea pig will give hearing losses 40–60 dB. At 180, the animals will die. So let's take this here, 100, as the threshold where we create a hearing loss. We have new drugs that will absolutely not show any ototoxicity at double the amount of gentamicin, 4 times the amount of gentamicin, and 8 times the amount of gentamicin. And they have just about the same efficacy. So we would have an increased safety factor of about 8-fold in animals. And if we can translate only a fraction of that into humans, will be a big step forward. So, in a nutshell, oxidative stress definitely is part of it, and antioxidant therapy is successful. And we can translate, as we showed you with aminoglycoside antibiotics. For aminoglycosides, that's good, in my opinion. In noise-induced hearing loss, yes, we can protect, maybe not, in humans, but what we have to look at is the hearing loss that's based on the loss of synaptic connections in the inner ear, and not necessarily the loss that leads to the loss of hair cells. And we have to look at, in addition to antioxidants, at neurotrophins as potential rescue agents. So where does it leave us today? We're all aware of environmental noise pollution. Turn your music player down, as you will probably, I'm quite sure, advise all your kids and your young patients. Don't take clinical drugs. And if you can, avoid aging. That's the worst. Thank you.